we are today extremely grateful to have with us Professor Paul Vitz. Dr. Paul Vitz is here with us speaking from the United States, and it is wonderful to have you here with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to people all over, really all over Europe, maybe all over the world.
Dr. Paul Vitz is senior scholar and professor at the Institute for Psychological Sciences, which is now part of Divine Mercy University in Sterling, Virginia. He's also professor emeritus at New York University. Dr. Vitz current teaching and research is centered on the integration of Christian theology, particularly Catholic anthropology, with psychology. This requires breaking from the modern secularism and postmodern relativism that are prevalent today. He's also working on the psychology of hatred and forgiveness, the psychological importance of fathers, and the relevance of psychology for understanding atheism and the psychology of the virtues. He is a co-editor of the recently published work titled A Catholic Christian Meta Model for the person, Integration of Psychology and Mental Health Practice. In 2019, he presented an introduction to this book to 3 universities in Spain. One of them, I believe, was Francisco Vitoria, and since then at various other places interested in a Christian, especially Catholic approach to psychology. Dr. Vitz, it's a great honor to have you with us. We're glad you're, I assume, speaking to us from Sterling, Virginia. Are you?
Well, nearby, Reston, Virginia, just outside of Sterling.
Okay, which is not far from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Let me begin now. As you know, in the webinar, we're trying to explore the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, from an expanded recent perspective. So let me begin by asking you a little bit about how your research and teaching has changed because of the pandemic. I don't mean by teaching online. I'm teaching about how you're thinking about the work that you've been doing in the previous years may have been modified or affected by the virus and the epidemic.
All right. Well, one of the things that I've noticed, and maybe everyone has, but is that the interpretation of the virus has been very reductionistic in terms of the medical understanding of it. Often models were proposed that were highly problematic to begin with, and then presented to the public as though this was science telling you what the answer would be and what was going to happen. And at the very best, these models ignored the impact of the lockdown on people independent of the virus itself. In other words, you need to expand the framework within which you look at the consequences of a pandemic, not just look at the possibility and the real suffering of death due to the virus per se, but to look at the consequences of the lockdown on people's health and well-being as well. In other words, what is the psychological impact as well as the medical issues that you're addressing? And for example, in this country, at any rate, the psychological impact showed up in huge increases in anxiety and depression, increases in suicide, and in other forms of distress of a psychological kind. For example, many families that were already in trouble, things just broke apart when they were forced to be at home all the time with each other. And so what I would propose is that the politicians or the people that look at the consequences of a pandemic also look at the consequences of the response to the pandemic in terms of its effect on things that are larger than just the individual deaths of the persons involved, so that you look at the larger context of the psychology, even the medical context of other illnesses that are disproportionately affected by it, and expand, if you will, the framework of understanding your context and its effects.
How would you advise professors, since most of our audience are university professors, how would you advise them to deal with students under the stress and situation that the pandemic is perhaps causing for their families and themselves?
Well, of course, as you know, I'm a psychologist, so I would suggest that what I would propose is something like this, is that if a pandemic can occur with the lockdown that we've seen, or if other things could cause the lockdown, whatever events they might be, we should have available ways online for people like students who are upset and disturbed because they're lonely and isolated and not in a family context with other support. And so they need people. There should be ways for the psychologists or the psychology program at the university to go online and have internet sessions that are especially addressed to the problems of anxiety and depression and meaninglessness and boredom that might strike students. So those should be prepared in advance so that you know what to do when this happens.
One of your interests is the issue of hatred and forgiveness. And in relationship to this work and the events that are happening, what issues do you see have concretely for your science and or professional life have this pandemic raised? I'm thinking specifically about the questions of the tension that has arisen because of the lack of freedom that people feel, not just in the United States, which is very noticeable, but also in Europe and in Spain.
Well, I guess I would say this, that one of the things one has to avoid when you're in this lockdown is increasing your anger and hatred. At least first of all, anger is a natural reaction. It's not wrong one way or the other, but when you cultivate the anger, you create hatred. You're not supposed to let the sun go down on your anger. Scripture says, be angry, but sin not. And the sinning with anger is the cultivating it in a scenario usually of revenge or of getting back. And you cultivate that, and that is harmful to you. In other words, as Christians, we understand as Catholics that this is a sin. But everybody should be made aware of the fact that if you cultivate anger, you will harm yourself. In the short run, you feel good about it because it makes you feel strong and maybe morally superior and so forth. But in the long run, hatred and vengeance destroy your own life. And so you should let go of it if you can. You should come to an understanding of the person you hate and not hate them and recognize, why should I hurt myself? This person that I dislike is now causing me to harm myself by just cultivating anger about him or her. And so one of the things you can do is to talk to people in a way that would say, look, I know this is an unpleasant situation that you're in, but don't increase your own anger, bitterness, and hatred against those people you see responsible for it, because that will harm you. And of course, if they're a Christian, you say it, not only that, you're supposed to pray for your enemies. You're not supposed to, spend your time in vengeance. Vendetta is very pagan. It may be big in literature and it may be big in opera, but it's not Christian. But independent of that, it's not good psychology. It's harmful for you to get all involved in this kind of scenarios of revenge. And so you should try to spend your time, if you're in lockdown or something like that, focusing on more positive things. Above all, find some new things to do, learn French or study mathematics or enjoy a painting class or a history of art or something of that kind, or study opera or music or filmmaking. These are all wonderful things you can do when you have lockdown, and they're positive, and they'll keep you from sitting there and stewing in your own hatred.
Let me ask you about another aspect of the pandemic. Many of our faculty members are in the health sciences, and a good number of them are actively practicing medicine even during these times because of the need in hospitals and so on, at various levels, medical doctors, nurses, and so on. On the one hand, what do you say to them from this expanded recent perspective, a view of psychology from the Christian view? And also, what would you say to the other side of the people who are also involved with health sciences, relatives and friends, and some of our own professors who have been to the hospital because of the pandemic? As you know, Madrid was very heavily affected. So we know,
Yes.
and have had colleagues and relatives who have been in ICU, have been very much affected, and some relatives, especially elderly, who have passed away because of it. So is there any word you can say first to the healthcare providers among our faculty, and also to those who are involved with healthcare as patients and relatives?
Well, to the healthcare people, there's relatively little I can say, except for them to be aware of the psychological consequences that I've already mentioned, so that they should be alert to them. And it would be very helpful if the psychological clinics could address, online. In other words, the doctors are often the first line of observation of people with mental problems. And if they see somebody showing depression or suicidal thought, they should, if you will, if you have them available, if you have psychological programs available, you should tip off your clinic to say, look, you might email this person and ask that if they need some help, you might be able to give it to them. The other thing is always be aware that most of the information I've known about doctors personally has been they've been quite aware of the context of the situation, far more aware of it than the politicians who are making decisions higher up, that have sometimes shown to me their absence of understanding the context. So the medical personnel have in general, I think, responded quite well already. But I would suggest that if they detect anxiety or depression or suicidal issues, that they see that they take advantage of any psychological support that's available. Not on their own, of course, just tell the clinic, tell a psychologist, tell somebody. They know somebody who could probably use their help.
Okay. Into colleagues who have gone as patients, what would you say to them?
Say that again.
To people who have been patients in hospitals or whose relatives have gone through the experience of the pandemic themselves.
For them, well, in many ways, the most important part of that whole experience is probably a spiritual understanding of it. And as a psychologist, I have to beg out of that. In other words, the spiritual understanding, I think, would be important for people to get afterwards. And if they did discover that when they were going through the illness from which, let's say, they've recovered, if they discovered any special psychological issue that was on their mind, they should address it. Maybe they should have forgiven somebody. Maybe they felt a special need to be in touch with someone that they had failed to be in touch with. We'll tell them, now you have a chance to do that. So get in touch with that person you felt that if you died, you had let down.
Okay. Are there any questions that you recognize that are now new to you, that you had not asked before, or that did not seem important to you before, but are now important?
Yes, one big question, I suppose it's obvious, is that the effect of being of a lockdown and the extent to which people live on the internet has made it clear to me that studying the effects of virtual communication, setting up programs to deal with them, and other programs to deal with what is missing in virtual interaction are now suddenly becoming very, very important and central. I realize that the whole virtual world of psychology, or the effects of it, remain relatively unexplored and unknown. So what are the effects of having lots of virtual interactions and not many direct and physical bodily interactions? What are those effects? I'm sure they're not helpful, but what are they exactly, and how might you counter them, and so forth? All of these then become important issues.
Okay. In your previous comments, I think you raised questions about themes that have emerged from a professional perspective. But are there any issues or themes that this pandemic has raised for you personally?
Oh yes, I must say this. In general, for me personally, it's been a good time. I want people to know that there can be lots of good responses to the lockdown. My wife and I we've enjoyed, we can't go to actual mass and receive, but we've gone to a lot of live streaming masses in other parts of the world. Our Lady of Walsingham in England has a wonderful mass that we've gone to. We've gone to a mass also at EWTN in Alabama, which we had not done this before. And we've become aware of the Catholic community much larger than here in Northern Virginia. It's been a great sense of contact with the church as a world phenomenon. In addition, we've found some new activities that, we realized we had extra time. And so my wife has been listening to an incredible number of operas, all of them from the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And she's listened to over 60 of them already now. And so in one few months time, she's had 2 lifetimes of going to opera in the normal way. And so I listened to a fair number of them with her too. And we've taken up a new hobby. It's fun. We're writing a film script for a movie, But the point of it is that whether it ever becomes a movie seems relatively unlikely, but it's fun. And so we're doing new activities and enjoying them very much. We have, of course, like most people, been not pleased with being cut off from our children and our family, but at least we've had the Zoom interactions there.
Wonderful. That's very, very good.
But we've had a good time. I almost feel guilty that I had a good time when everyone else seemed to report only suffering.
Now, one last question, if I may. Do you have any proposals from your science or profession that requires real dialogue with other disciplines? Thinking of the expanded reason perspective we like to propose. So do you have any proposals for real dialogue between or among disciplines to give a comprehensive and deeper response to the reality we live in?
I have one proposal, for what it's worth. There's a relatively recent publication by an Englishman. Now he's secular, I'm pretty sure, named Ian McGilchrist, and he's done a wonderful job in a book called The Master and His Emissary, published by Yale University Press. And the reason I bring him up is it's a very profound study, along with some more recent publications by McGilchrist, on the narrowness of the scientifically reductionist mind that we have, that is now defining what we mean by what's true or accurate or valid. And he expands that by criticizing from a brain hemisphere point of view. arguing that much of our real knowledge is partly found in what we would call right brain activities. And the science has become a reductionist left brain activity. So he wants to expand our understanding of knowledge to include a lot of the kinds of knowledge which are traditionally part of reason, but have been lost in the modern world with our focus on just the scientific reductionist position. So I advocate people reading Ian McGilchrist, particularly his, well, not only his 2009 book, The Master and His Emissary, but also his more recent publications as well, which are 2017 and 2013. He's a Brit, and I'm pretty sure he's not a believer of any kind, but he has a nice idea.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Paul Vitz. It's been wonderful to hear you speak about these issues and the pandemic, and I'm very happy to hear your personal experience with you and your wife.
Yeah.
Sounds like you had a great experience, and maybe you'll have a few months still, because by the looks of it.
Yeah, we're behind Europe here. We still have our, we haven't quite peaked in every one of our states, but we're beginning to unlock, but we're not there yet.
Right. So thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
No problem. Thank you very much. It's been an honor.